Hello, everyone, and welcome back to an all-new episode of The Financial Confessions. It's me, your host, Chelsea Fagan, founder and CEO of The Financial Diet and woman who loves to talk about money. And today we are going to be talking to someone who also talks about money as their full-time job and who came to being a financial educator through somewhat disastrous means, although as someone who started talking about money because of her own destroyed credit score and debt that was in collections and having been arrested, I am definitely no stranger to coming to financial health out of sheer necessity. My guest today is a full-time content creator and financial educator now who specifically focuses on overcoming overspending to the point that it's actually the name of her very popular TikTok. She creates content both based on her own experience where she was blowing through a $60,000 a year salary with mindless overspending and also helping other people form a much healthier relationship to their own financial desires and impulses and needs. We gathered a truly incredible number of questions from you guys, so a lot of our conversation is going to be the questions that you sent in, but I did want to start with a little one-on-one just about the concept of overspending and how it impacted her own financial health and how she got to the place that she is today being such a mindful spender. And thanks to ZocDoc for supporting the Financial Confessions. ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. Go to ZocDoc.com/TFC and download the ZocDoc app to sign up for free and book a top-rated doctor. Without further ado, I want to welcome my guest today, Paige Pritchard. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. That was quite the intro. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So I obviously teed it up a little bit, but tell me in a little bit more detail your overspending story and, what brought you to creating the content that you now do.
Yeah. So like you said, I definitely got to where I am today and do what I do. It's very autobiographical. In the past, really struggled with overspending. In fact, my spending and shopping got to the point where I was a compulsive shopper. It was to the point where it was like a compulsion for me. But it really began when I graduated from college and I did what a lot of millennials do is, I was strapped with $40,000 of student loan debt and I was moving back to the city that I grew up in. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to move in with my parents. And they graciously said, hey, you can live here for a year. We know you have student loan debt. We know you don't really have any savings. We know you're going to be making a decent income. I actually got hired to go sell cars at a car dealership, and they offered to pay me $60,000 for my first year and give me a Cadillac to drive and pay for a lot of the expenses that you traditionally have to pay for as an adult, like my car payment, my gas, my insurance, my cell phone bill. So I was super excited because I was like, look, this is going to be a fantastic year for me to really build like a solid financial footing at the very young age of 22 at the time. And to make a long story short, that is not what ended up happening. I remember going to the mall and spending my very first paycheck on a new wardrobe because at the time I really didn't have, like a corporate girl wardrobe. And so I remember that first shopping trip and going and spending my entire paycheck and telling myself like, okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm not going to buy anymore. But shortly after that, it was almost kind of like life, at least to me, it felt like started to unravel in a lot of ways. I really missed my friends from college. I did not do well, like going from having like 4 years of independence to then living with my parents again. Me and my college boyfriend broke up. And I very quickly realized that I hated selling cars. And so I was dealing with a lot of negative emotion at the time. And my way to cope with that negative emotion was to go shop. And so on my lunch breaks, I would leave the dealership. I would go up to the mall, do this several times a week. And it was not uncommon for me to just like walk into, Anthropologie or Nordstrom's or Banana Republic and just like drop like $300, $400, $500 on my lunch break very casually. And, that year by some miracle, I guess I can say like the one thing that I would always do is I would always check to see how much money I had in my checking account. And I'd be like, okay, well, this is how much I could spend. But I was basically spending right up to that point. And at the end of that year, it came time to move out. My parents are like, okay, the gig's up. We've given you a year. It's time for you to go. And I couldn't even afford a security deposit to move out of my parents' house. And my parents are looking at me like, what do you mean? Like, you've made $60,000 a year. Where did all your money go? Because it really had gotten to the point where I was hiding my behavior, right? Like, I would wait to bring the shopping bags in, or I would bring the packages in when I knew my parents weren't home or when I knew they wouldn't see me. And I had to wait until I got paid again and use, my next paycheck to essentially just get to a point where I could move out. My entire closet, or my entire paycheck, was in my closet. And that was really the point where I was like, okay, like, something's got to give and something's got to change, because if I keep doing this, I'm going to be broke for the rest of my life. And I do feel lucky in a sense that I kind of had my financial wake up moment, or, my like come to Jesus moment at a very young age, because, I work with women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they're like, well, that's good for you, Paige, that you had that realization at 23. But I'm 33, 43, 53, and just now having that realization. But I have to say, it's like whatever point you're at having this realization, like, it's never too late. But I set out to find solutions to my problem. And all I could really find was just a bunch of old white men telling me to like stop eating out and unsubscribe from emails and unfollow people on social media and to like cut out my lattes. And first of all, it wasn't very helpful to me at all, because I didn't feel like they understood me or understood my situation. And secondly, it was all just these like external band-aids. It was like, just go around and manipulate your external environment, kind of like wrap yourself in bubble wrap so that you never again get an email, or you never again like see your favorite influencer on social media and you're kind of like tempted to shop. And the issue for me ran much, much deeper than that, right? There was a lot of mindset behind it. There was a lot of emotions behind it. So I kind of set out to find my own solution and make my own solutions. And that's what I've been working on for the past decade. But I will say that I feel like in the past, probably 4 to 5 years, this issue has really come to a head, which is why I really felt the need to kind of niche down into this area, because I've talked about money for a really long time. And in the beginning, I used to talk about anything and everything related to money. Like, if it touched money, I would talk about it. But this was the issue that kept coming up over and over and over, but it was also happening in secret. Like, people would come into my DMs, they would email me. It was never out open in the public, people being like, hey, like, I'm in $10,000 worth of credit card debt because of shopping, or, hey, I have this debt that my partner doesn't know about that I'm hiding from them. Because I feel like rise in technology. So think like Amazon, how easy it is to shop. And social media is the second one. I think social media has really brought this issue to a head. And then the pandemic. I think those three things kind of in the last 4 to 5 years have created this perfect storm. And I didn't see anyone out there talking about this issue specifically. So I was like, I've been through this. I understand it. I feel like I have solutions that actually work. I'm not embarrassed or ashamed to talk about it. So if I have to be the one to do it, I'm happy to do it. So that was the birth of Overcoming Overspending and how I got to where I am today.
There's so much in your story that I resonated with as someone who did overspend themselves into credit card debt and into a lot of financial problems. And the way I always kind of framed it in terms of, the psychology of it, because as I have been very open about on the channel, like, I grew up low income, and in my teens moved to a very affluent community where I was surrounded by, people who didn't just have a lot more than me, they had a lot more than the average American. So kind of my perception became very, very skewed. But the way I kind of framed it looking back is sort of the idea of trying to spend yourself into being a different person. That there is something fundamentally about a certain purchase, a certain item, often for women especially, it can be a certain look that will do heavier lifting on a personal and psychological level than I think is possible for any consumer item to do. And we recently had an episode with our guest, Heather Hurst, one of my favorite episodes of late, where we talked a lot about the idea of curating personal style in sort of the noise of this hyper consumerism. But I think at an even deeper level, no matter what the spending is, there is sort of always that fine line between purchasing something that has meaning for yourself versus purchasing something in the interest of becoming a different self, in the interest of being able to purchase a life or a persona or an interior being that you want. So now that you have reached this much healthier relationship with spending, how are you able to distinguish between those purchases that are aspirational on a healthy level versus an unhealthy or irrational level?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I will say this too. And I think, a lot of people can relate to this, right? Like I've spent a lot of time thinking about this for myself during that period of time when I was doing a lot of shopping. And you're absolutely right, because I remember going to the mall and having like these movies that we grew up with, right? Like the How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, Andy Anderson, and the 13 Going on 30, like her closet in that movie, and The Devil Wears Prada. That was the actual idea that I had in my head, like as a working girl, of what my closet should look like, what my life should look like, how I should be like showing up and presenting myself to work. So I can say that at one point in time absolutely played a huge role in that. But you're right. Aspirational spending is one of the like trickiest types of spending to overcome, because on the surface, it does seem very virtuous, right? It's kind of like, oh, I'm using this spending to try to get me closer to this future version of myself that I kind of idealize myself as. And for me, one of the biggest and most powerful tools to use, especially when we're talking, I think that this tip really helps well when you're talking about certain like hobbies and things like that, is I always say like, give yourself the proof before you make the purchase. So let me give you a couple examples here. Like, let's just say you kind of have this idea in your head that you want to become someone who is a runner, right? What a lot of us do is before we even start the process of running, our brains immediately go to like, what do I need to buy in order for me to like be a good runner? And so we'll go out and we'll get the shoes and the Lulu set and, all the technology and all the things that we think that we need to start running. Now, the feedback that I always get from a lot of people, which I totally understand this mindset as well, is people are like, well, if I go out and I buy a bunch of things, it'll almost like motivate me to do it. It's almost kind of like I've already spent all this money on it. So that will kind of be like the kick in the pants or the motivation for me to go and do the thing. But what I often find is like in the beginning, it might be motivating, but oftentimes what ends up happening is like you still end up falling off of the activity, because consumer culture that we live in like wants to tell us that products have the ability to give us like a whole new personality and to give us a whole new identity. And so we actually go out spending our money buying these things thinking that it's like, oh, well, not only am I buying a new pair of running shoes, I'm buying myself like a whole new personality, a whole new identity as this person who runs. When in actuality, the identity that you're looking for, or that personality that you're trying to aspire to step into, a lot of the times comes from one of two things. It comes from your mindset, and it also comes from action, right? Like taking action. And a lot of times, like, let's just stick with this running example. It's like, what's going to give you the identity as a runner is for you to actually go out and start running. I see this a lot with like organizational products or like productivity products as well, right? Like planners or, like those cute little like organizational bins. It's kind of like, if you want to start journaling, you don't need like the $60 pretty leather bound monogrammed journal to get you to start journaling, because ultimately, like to your point, what you're after is an identity. And how you're going to form that identity is through actually journaling. So again, going back to like giving yourself the proof before the purchase. I'm like, the proof is what is actually going to give you the thing that you're looking for, which is kind of this new personality, this new identity, this new embodiment as somebody who now does fill in the blank. And what's going to give you that is by actually doing it. And I think too, I want to say this, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with like going out and buying the new running shoes or buying the fancy journal. I just want to make sure that you're actually getting use and value out of it. So kind of a rule of thumb that I give to the women in my community is, can we just show ourselves for 30 days that we're committed to either this activity or committed to building this new identity? Because I find that 90% of the time, you either have what you already need, you have what you need to kind of get you by in that first 30 days, or you can borrow from a friend, right? Like in some off cases where people are like, well, I don't have this thing I need, I don't have that thing I need. It's like, well, do you know somebody who potentially you could borrow it from? And I always say, like, after 30 days, if you've run consistently, if you've journaled consistently, if you've done the thing consistently, and it really feels like this is something that I'm liking, this is something that I'm enjoying, this is something that I think I'm actually going to stick with, at that point in time, I'm like, okay, then we can go out. But you're right. It's so tricky, but it's just like, try it out first. And then if you want to go buy things to support the new identity, go ahead.
Well, and I also think for a lot of people, you know, at least in my case, like, yes, there are occasionally, like, I had a pair of tap shoes for several years that like literally did nothing but collect dust. So like, that's a great example of what you're talking about. But I think for a lot of people, it can also be trying to become a different person in terms of class, in terms of social status, in terms of, you know, beauty. I mean, you know, one of the video essays that we're going to be doing in the new year is all about, you know, the class signifiers rather of beauty and appearance. I mean, a perfect example being, you know, teeth, and like how straight your teeth are is heavily associated with class. And, you know, there's that adage about you're not ugly, you're just broke. Like and I think especially seeing, you know, younger generations on, you know, I'm on TikTok, obviously you are, like, on these apps, the normalization of being able to spend your way into the appearance of not just affluence in terms of the labels that you're wearing and the purse you might be carrying, but affluence in terms of, you know, how symmetrical your face is, how shiny your hair is, how, you know, new your lash extensions are. And I think that is a level of, you know, consumption and overspending that, like, at least for me, like, I often feel so lucky that I graduated high school before social media was even a thing, because I now feel like for young girls, especially now, there are entirely new categories of spending that, to my mind, didn't even really exist 10 to 15 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier about social media, right? It's just, it's introduced all of these different layers into our spending across the levels of comparison that we're now able to do, right? And how that actually, like, impacts us to spend, of just all these, like, unrealistic standards that we feel like we have to meet. And then also having this just, like, added layer into thousands of people's lives that we have never seen before. And so it's taken these levels of comparison to a whole new level, and us trying to use our money to achieve that standard. And I say, like, it's so hard with social media, but it's just like, you get yourself on this, like, spending hamster wheel that almost at times feels impossible to get off, right? Like, because as soon as you feel like you've gotten to the point where you've gotten your hair the way it should look, your skin the way it should look, your makeup, your skin routine, your wardrobe the way it should look, it's like the goalpost moves, right? And then there's just like one more thing that you need and one more thing that you have to start chasing, right? So I completely agree with you. Social media is a killer in this area.
And it's also, I mean, we're, like, not for nothing, but, like, it's, you know, by the time this airs, this will be airing in December. So we're in, like, peak you don't need season in terms of, like, you know, I think for the goalposts moving, one of the things that always blows my mind as someone who loves home decor and follows a lot of home decor content, like, my mom is someone who has always been very into decor. We always had a very elaborately decorated home at Christmas, but it was always with the same decorations. Like, we had our boxes of Christmas decorations, we had our lights, we had our, you know, stockings, and the same ones went up every year. And that was, I think, the norm. Like, I think it would have been highly unusual. And granted, we didn't have a ton of money to be buying new stuff, but even for my friends who lived in, more impressive homes, they still like broke out their home decor every year. And I think for most people, that is still the norm. That's still how I operate. But I think it's become now almost an expectation, like just like you will change your clothes, like it's not just that you're decorating for holidays every year, it's that you're decorating with an entirely new set of decor and you have a different color scheme. You have all of these other things that, again, I think part of the reason why you mentioned that overconsumption feels like it's reached such a peak is that also because with it just feels like the expectations for what, a normal middle class life even looks like have become, it's like looking into a funhouse mirror.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say this too, like for anyone who's listening to this, because I don't know the kind of feedback that you guys get on your social media, but this is something that I kind of hear a lot, right? On my TikTok is I feel like I don't know if we're ever going to right size the ship of consumerism. Like sometimes I get asked that, like, do you actually think that this is something that we can change and completely right size the ship on? And part of me is just like, I don't know if we actually can, but it is an individual choice that each one of us have. And I will say that I do think that I'm hearing more and more and more and more. It's like every day I get on, I just feel like I'm hearing a little bit more of people kind of starting to wake up a little bit and starting to kind of opt themselves out of saying like, A, this is completely unrealistic. B, this is getting to a point where it's not even like fun for me. It's not inspiring for me. It's not even like aspirational for me anymore. It's just getting to a point where this makes me feel bad more than it makes me feel good. And really starting to kind of tune in to, okay, do I actually like this? Does this feel aligned to me? Does this align with my values and my priorities? Because if I'm really being honest with myself, like it doesn't. And sometimes like people just need to hear that. like people just need to hear, like, if you're on social media and you see something that kind of gives you that feeling where you're just like, this just doesn't feel like, it doesn't have to be a full blown ick, but it's just like, this just doesn't feel right to me. Like something feels a little bit off about this to me. I really, really encourage you to listen to that voice, because I think that that's like the first small, but like kind of mighty step that all of us have to take in terms of like social media and this overconsumption, just to say like, it's okay if my life doesn't look like this. It's okay if my Christmas tree doesn't look like this. It's okay if I don't have a little like car organizational thing in my car that, has like hand sanitizer and lotion and this and this. Like, it's okay to start like opting out of those things. And if something feels off to you, if something doesn't feel in alignment to you, like I want you to listen to that. Because again, like I said, that's kind of like the first step that we all need to take, and kind of like getting to a point where we're all opting out of this, because until we get to that point, it's never going to change. It's only going to continue to get worse.
Well, you mentioned earlier that for you, the relationship that you had to spending, you kind of classified as a compulsion, which is obviously very close to and often overlaps with addiction, right? People have shopping addictions, which can be, obviously financially ruinous, right? I had a member of my extended family who had such a severe shopping addiction that they ended up losing their home. They ended up like the most catastrophic results. And as you were mentioning, like had been hiding this from their spouse for years and years. And it got to a level of consequence that I think, would parallel with any other addiction. But I think often with money and with spending, we don't think of it as an addiction. We sometimes don't even think of it as a compulsion, because as we've discussed, like we live in a culture that so normalizes overconsumption and almost demands overconsumption. So can you talk a little bit about the framing in your mind around things like shopping and compulsion, shopping addiction, and how using that framing is a valuable or was a valuable resource to you for actually treating the issue?
Yeah. Great question. Well, I want to say this to kind of start off, is that you're absolutely right. It's crazy because I feel like, issues with shopping, overspending, full-blown shopping addictions are not given the attention that they deserve. And a shopping addiction, to your point, is a very real thing that can have disastrous consequences. And the crazy thing is that, you have alcohol addiction and drug addiction and gambling addiction. A shopping addiction is no different from those things, but it's actually the one type of addiction that's not recognized within the medical community. Right. Mm-hmm. It's not officially recognized as like an actual legitimate addiction. Right. And I think people are pushing for it to get to that point because I think a lot of people realize that it is. But that just goes to show you how in our society, it's not taken as a serious thing. And I think if you go on social media, you'll see people like laughing about it and joking about it all the time. Like, oh, haha, my cute little shopping addiction. But if it's something that you're actually living through and struggling with, it's, to your point, a very real thing. And so I'll kind of give people just maybe some signs to look out for, and then kind of answer your question at the end of how it kind of helped me get to a point of taking it seriously. But, if it feels like something like that, again, you just feel drawn to do, right? Like constantly. It's like, there's nothing really that you need. There's nothing that you really want. It's just kind of like you feel that urge to just constantly be out buying things and spending money. You're spending a lot of your time shopping, whether it's online shopping or going up to malls or going up to Target. You're just spending a ton of your time, searching for deals, unboxing things, tracking shipments, returning things, reselling things. If you're hiding your behavior, like I said, if this is something that's starting to create rifts and tension in your personal relationships, right? If any of those things kind of start to ring a bell, it could be like, okay, this is definitely a time where I might want to look into getting some help for this and getting some resources that can help. But I mean, for me, like I said, not having the money, which making the money that I was making should have had at that point, realizing I can't even move out of my parents' house. Like I said, that was really kind of like my wake up moment to say like, okay, this is something that I need to start taking small steps to improve. But I also want to say too, that if it does get to a point where it's a compulsion or a full on addiction, you also have to be realistic with yourself that this isn't something that you're going to be able to solve with Band-Aid solutions, kind of like I called at the beginning. Like, you're not just going to be able to go to Google and Google like, well, how do I stop impulse shopping? Because like I said, all you're going to get is like, well, just unsubscribe from emails and just don't go on social media and, just kind of like all the Band-Aid solutions. And also understand that this is going to take time to solve. Like, you're not going to be able to go from like being a compulsive shopper to the point that I am overnight. And I just, I know I went through my story very quickly. This has been 12 years in the making, just to kind of give everybody like a frame of reference here, just to say that like it does take time. But if any of those things resonated with you, like, please take it seriously. I know it's difficult to in the world that we live in, because I know like your friends are probably joking about it. People on social media joke about it. And so you might get the idea in your head of like, well, is this an actual problem? Like, is this something that I really need to dive into and look to solve? But again, like, listen to that voice inside of yourself. And if it's getting to the point where it's impacting your ways or impacting your life in a lot of negative ways, financially, of course, but also non-financially, right? Like your environment, clutter, your relationships, your time, that's a big indication that, okay, this is getting to a point where I need to do something about it.
Well, to your point about it not being taken seriously as an addiction in line with other addictions, like so much of what we have normalized, like, for example, clothing stores now having like hundreds of micro seasons a year instead of a few. Or, when you go on, I mean, obviously haul videos are an extreme example that is very, very normalized, but like, I'm sure we all get targeted with those videos of people like restocking their refrigerator or their pantry with, first of all, like enough food to like stock a 7-Eleven. But also it's not even just the food itself. It's like everything has to be transferred to these really aesthetically pleasing containers that, themselves cost money, and everything is perfectly optimized. And like, don't get me wrong, like they are relaxing to watch in a certain way, but framing it through, compulsion or addiction as it pertains to consumerism, like if you take one step back from that, like imagine that were any other substance, or imagine that were any other thing besides shopping and consuming, you'd be like, holy shit, lady, like you obviously have a serious problem. There's no reason you need to be buying, 50 bags of Cheez-Its and then, putting them all into these tiny little perfectly organized containers, because that's just not, you can justify spending, like, and that's the thing, right? Like, so much of our culture is predicated on justifying more. Like, we live in bigger houses than ever before. We drive bigger cars. We have all these extra rooms we don't use. We're just so acclimated now to the idea of like any spending is totally justifiable. And because we often frame self-care through the lens of things that you can purchase, like, it totally makes sense that we wouldn't recognize it as an addiction, because if that's the case, then like the whole society is somewhat, needs to look at their own behavior.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just like one of those things that just like obviously rings so true to me, because it's just like, there's just no end. Like there's just no end to the list of things that like you're constantly going to be told on a daily basis that you need to buy. And I always say like advertising is basically just like creating problems for you that you like didn't even know existed. Social media does that nowadays too. Like to your point, my favorite are the ice cube ones, like, right, where people have like 50 different types of ice cubes and like 50 different types of like ice cube trays. You're like, no, but you need your strawberry slice ice cubes. You need your big square ice cubes. You need your Sonic ice cubes. It's just like, to your point, there's no end to the amount of stuff that you need, whether it's your fridge, your pantry, your ice cube trays, your, skincare. It's just like, there's no end to it. And yeah, I mean, it's, like I said, a very, very serious thing that you just have to get to a point where you're like, when is enough going to be enough for me? And something that I'm telling the women in my community all the time is like, listen, you're going to go out and the world that we live in is going to sell you the message of more, bigger is better, newer is better, fancier is better. But the truth is like every human being has a point of enoughness and has a point of sufficiency, which is basically the point where you have enough to where any spending or consumption that you do past your points of enoughness and sufficiency will actually start to bring down your levels of happiness and fulfillment. And this is something called the fulfillment curve, which is actually in the book. I don't know if you've read it, but it's a very popular personal finance book, so I'm sure you've had, but it's the book called Your Money or Your Life by Vicki Robin and Joe Dominguez. And it's something called the fulfillment curve. And it looks like the St. Louis Arch, right? It just kind of looks like the hump of a roller coaster. And the very top of that hump is what they call sufficiency. And so really any spending that you do up to your points of sufficiency will increase levels of happiness and fulfillment. So that's things like, making sure your basic needs are met, getting some wants, maybe even getting some luxuries, depending on what that looks like for you in particular. But what they say is like, each one of us is going to reach the top of that curve. We're going to reach enoughness and sufficiency. And then consumption that we do past that point is actually going to start to bring down your levels of happiness and fulfillment. And I know a lot of us have experienced that. Like, I know I certainly experienced that, where you're going out, you're shopping, you're buying, you're consuming, you're doing it under this guise of like, this is going to make me so happy. This is going to make me so fill in the blank. And then it doesn't. And then all you're left with is like confusion and disappointment of like, well, why didn't that work? Why didn't it give me the thing that I thought that it was going to give me? But instead of our brains going to, oh, okay, wait, well, maybe it's not actually the consumption's job or the product's job to do that for me. Maybe it's because I've reached the point where I'm like, my consumption is consuming me. We have all been trained to think, oh, that just wasn't it. Right? That just wasn't the right face serum. That just wasn't the right, organizational bins. It must be this now. It must be this now. And so that's the spending hamster wheel that we get ourselves on, where you're just spending and consuming, and all it's doing is just making you unhappier. And instead of realizing, wait, maybe the solution to this is just to get off this ride we think it's just consume more, consume more, consume more, which then ironically just digs you deeper, 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 deeper.
Have you ever been looking for a new doctor and asking around to basically everyone you know if they have any recommendations? Because that has been me many, many times. And I feel like every time I ask people, it's like pretty rare that people have an actual good recommendation. And when they do, it's often not even in my network. But on the rare occasion someone has a doctor they really like, it's nearly impossible to make an appointment with them. Here in New York City, this is actually pretty common. It can be hard to get an appointment with a doctor for literal months, which is not great if you have an actual medical emergency. And let's not even get into finding someone that meets all your needs and also takes your insurance. Like I said, that is like finding a unicorn. So enter ZocDoc. ZocDoc is a free app where you can find amazing doctors and book appointments online. We're talking about booking appointments with thousands of top-rated, patient-reviewed doctors and specialists. You can filter specifically for ones who take your insurance, are located near you, and treat almost any condition you're searching for. The average wait time to see a doctor booked on ZocDoc is between just 24 and 48 hours. That's it. You can even find same-day appointments. Once you find the doctor you want, you can book them immediately with just a few app taps. No more waiting on hold for an hour to be connected to the right department. As someone who has personally been using ZocDoc for literally a decade plus, like I've been using it for as long as I can remember, I used it to find and then to book appointments with dermatologist, dentist, therapist, general practitioner, like basically every single kind of doctor I use. It's genuinely an incredibly useful app. So go to ZocDoc.com/TFC and download the ZocDoc app for free. They find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/TFC. ZocDoc.com/TFC. Well, on that note, as I mentioned, we got a huge number of questions from our audience. So let's dive into those. So this one is a good question to start with, kind of fun. How did you manage your overspending when trying to date?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, okay, I have to be honest. I don't know if I'm necessarily like the best person to ask this question, but I'm happy to kind of give some tips because I say that because so I actually ended up meeting my now husband at the car dealership that I was working at when I was doing like all of this overspending. So it was kind of like we were actually dating while I was like doing all of that overspending. So I haven't dated in a while, but here's the thing. I would say like one of my big things is like really paying attention to the season of life that you're in right now, looking at the past spending that you're doing and just saying like, where is a lot of my money going right now, and be proactive about that and plan for that. So if you are somebody who's kind of like in a dating season right now and within, let's just say like a given month, you know that you're probably going to be going on like 4, 5, however many dates, right? You decide what that looks like for you. Just plan it ahead of time and pick a number ahead of time that makes sense for you to spend within your spending plan, right? Spending plan is just kind of like what I call a budget. So maybe you're like, okay, going into this month, I'm going to set aside $200 for drinks, for dinners, for activities this month that I'm going to specifically spend on dates. Because I just think if you go into it like willy-nilly, A, you'll end up spending just whatever, but B, that money is going to get sucked up elsewhere by other things. And so if this is something that's a priority to you right now, and it's the season that you're in and you know you're going to be spending money on it, just decide ahead of time. Like, how much money do I want to spend every single month on dates? Treat it just how you would groceries, eating out. Just have it be another kind of like line item in your spending plan.
Very good. How can I help someone in my life who has a huge spending problem without coming off as judgmental?
Great question. I get this question a lot. So what I always say is that you always have to approach the situation with curiosity and compassion, because I think that most people approach the situation with criticism and judgment, which I think the fact that you're even asking, like, how do I approach this without judgment is a great first step. Curiosity is one of my favorite emotions to always lead with. right? And I think like trying to understand why the person is doing what they're doing on a deeper level, other than just like, oh, they're just overspending or, oh, they just shop too much. Because I can guarantee you 100% of the time, there's something deeper going on. There's stuff going on with their mindset. A lot of the times it's an emotional issue. They're trying to escape hard negative emotions that they don't want to feel. They're trying to, buy something, like do a lot of the aspirational spending that you and I were talking about. And so I feel like just approach the situation with curiosity and don't even try to like bring up the shopping at first. Just try to approach it like you just want to have a conversation with them about like how they're doing, what's going on. I would never approach it from like, hey, you're shopping too much. Like, let's try to figure out why you're shopping too much. Because what I've found, and I know like for me, that would have done nothing but make me like close off and shop more. So approach them with curiosity. Just try to have, a conversation to see if you can get any insight into like what's going on deeper. And the third thing I always like to suggest is offer to spend time with the person and do activities with them that aren't shopping and that are completely free. And again, you don't have to tell the person that you're doing this. You don't have to be like, hey, I want to go doing these free activities with you. But it's like, can you invite them over for a dinner that you cook for them? Can you guys go on a walk? Can you guys go do something around the city that's completely free? I think just like spending time with the person and kind of like showcasing like the free fun and the free connection that is available to them is a great first step. If it does get to a point where you feel like it's appropriate at that point to have a conversation about it, I think just kind of like read the room, read the conversation. Only you know like what's going to be best for that specific relationship that you have. But I think those are some good first steps to kind of like dip your toes in the water versus just like coming out swinging like, hey, let's sit down and talk about your shopping problem. Because from what I've found, that never really ends up working well, like right out of the gate.
Well, and, to your point, you mentioned like if someone had come at you about this stuff when you were like in the height of your compulsive spending, it wouldn't have done anything but drive you further into it. I think like, yes, I think approaching with curiosity and compassion is always incredibly important if you are. But I also think like more generally, and I think this is like often as women, we typically take on these burdens for people that we love or care about or are connected to in a way that is not always super productive or helpful, in the sense that like a lot of people, like I have been doing financial education for a decade. I still have people in my own life who have very unhealthy financial situations, relationships to spending, etc. And at the end of the day, like if their finances are not tied up with mine, like that's their journey. And like similar to people who might be exhibiting any kind of unhealthy behaviors, like it is not up to you to control or change them. It's up to you to manage yourself and how you interact with that person. And like, obviously you don't want to do things that make it worse, or enable the worst behavior. But at the same time, like, I think this idea that we have, like, it's one thing if it's your romantic partner, right? And like your finances are very intertwined, but like, let's say this is a friend or a sibling or whatever, like, it's about you kind of making the decisions about what you're willing to engage with, about putting up your healthy boundaries, about deciding, like, for example, maybe you don't lend that person money. Maybe you don't do things with them that are like really spending oriented. But people are going to have to come to these things on their own timelines. And although we often want to hurry that process along, the reality is that, like, especially if the behavior has become very compulsive, very addictive, very, kind of psychologically oriented, like they're going to be on their own schedule, and like you will not be able to have control over that schedule. And it's like important to make peace with that in my mind.
I 100% agree with you. And like, even last week, I got an email from somebody who was like, hey, cause I have a podcast of my own, and this girl emailed me and she said, hey, like I sent your podcast to my mom and we were in the car, and I was like, well, why don't we turn on Paige's podcast and listen to it? And she said, my mom just turned it off after 5 minutes. And she's just like, I can't listen to this. Like, I'm not ready to listen to this. And I'm totally with you, Chelsea. Like, I think that people will get to a point where they feel ready to face the problem head on. And at the end of the day, it's like you can be there beside them, supporting them, but absolutely setting healthy boundaries along the way. But I mean, I know for me, like I had to come to the point myself, like no one else could do that. Right. And I always say like, well, I don't say this, everyone says this, but it's like the classic, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make them drink. Right. So it's like leading the horse to water in the sense of like you being a supportive, encouraging, setting healthy boundaries, fill in the blank, friend, sister, coworker, whatever. But at the end of the day, people have to come to that realization themselves. What I often find is like when they get drugged there and they get their face like shoved in the water, like drink this water, they just come up and they just go back to doing what they were always doing because they weren't ready for the change in the first place.
Totally. Are there any specific tools or strategies that you implemented in the early stages of cutting down your impulse spending?
Yeah. Great question. I'm happy to share a couple of the ones that really, really worked well for me. So I'll share kind of like the top two that worked really well for me and that I teach now in my community. So one of the most powerful things that you can do in the very beginning is giving yourself a pause between having that desire to shop or feeling that urge to splurge and actually buying something. And I feel like now more than ever, that time, that pause that we have between seeing something that we want and actually buying it is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, when like, just think about social media. Sometimes it's a matter of minutes, right? Between like seeing an ad for something and actually buying it. One of my primary rules, and I think the bigger the urge is, give yourself more time. But introducing just a pause for yourself in between seeing something and buying something, it sounds almost too simple to be effective and too simple to work. But this is the one thing that people are always like, just implementing this one rule has helped me so much. So giving yourself time to pause between seeing something and wanting something. My rule is start with 72 hours. So if you're still thinking about something, if it's still kind of like coming back to you after 72 hours and you have the money for it, like you're not going to be going into debt or putting it on a credit card to buy it. At that point, I'm like, okay, it's definitely a purchase that we can revisit. But going back to kind of like the psychological component, whenever you see something that you want to buy, like let's say you get an ad for something, let's say you're in Target and you see something, the pleasure systems in your brain start to activate. You start to get dopamine released in your brain, and your brain goes from being in a very like logical state of mind to a very emotional state of mind. And that emotional state is not the state that we want to be making our purchasing decision from, because that's the state where you're just kind of like buying things to buy things. When we can introduce this pause and give your brain some time, what that allows it to do is kind of like cool off in a sense and go back into that logical thing, that logical space. And just a good tool is to just start a list. I call mine a things I want to buy list, and I keep mine in Notion. I do recommend that this is something that's either like in a journal, in your notes app on your phone, or you can use something like Notion. Sometimes people would be like, oh, well, kind of like an Amazon wish list. And I say like, take it even farther, like take it off Amazon, right? Have one place where anything that you're currently considering buying goes onto this list. So what I do is like, if I'm on social media and I see something, I'll take a screenshot of it. I have a photo album on my phone that's called Things I Want to Buy. If I'm in a store, I'll snap a picture of it and everything gets added into this album. And then when I sit down on my computer, I probably do this like once or twice a week, but when I'm at my computer, I will go through that album and I will add anything onto that Things I Want to Buy list. And just by doing that, just by adding it onto my list is a hit of dopamine, right? Because dopamine is the anticipation molecule. It's what gets released in anticipation of a purchase. It also gets released when we do buy the purchase, but it's mostly released in the anticipation of it. And so by doing this, it's kind of like a win-win, because you are kind of getting that feel-good hit of dopamine that ultimately you're wanting by being able to buy something, but you're also having the advantage of giving your brain that cool-off period. And I would say that probably half the things that go on my list, I actually don't end up buying. The other tool is something that is called an urge jar. And I actually keep my urge jar at my desk. I'll show those of you who are watching, because I know some of y'all are watching this on YouTube, but like this is my urge jar. It's just 2 little containers. Just find anything that you have lying around your house. Find 100 of them. Bobby pins, your kids' Legos, marbles, just whatever. But whenever you do feel that urge to splurge, I want you just to kind of like sit with the urge, which if you allow the urge to splurge to pass and process through, it will probably last no more than 10 minutes. Like they say, typically an urge to splurge lasts anywhere from like 5 to like 7 minutes. And once I kind of like process through that urge and kind of breathe through it, I will just take like one trinket from one and I will add it to the other. And again, it seems simple, but the human brain likes to see progress. It likes to see accumulation. And what I'll also do is I'll keep a log of what I would have spent, but didn't. And I think in the beginning, like I think a lot of the advice that you'll hear is like, oh, instead of shopping, go out and take a walk, go out and knit, go out and like do all these other things, which yes, you can absolutely get to the point where you're doing that. But I think in the beginning, the trick is how can I almost like gamify and give myself a hit of dopamine by not spending the money. And the urge jar is really, really good at that because it's a visual representation of all of the money that you would have spent, but you didn't. And another really cool activity to do is to actually keep track of what you would have spent, but didn't. And what I have a lot of my clients do is keep track of that. And every, let's say every like 10 urges, total that up and show yourself like, this is what I would have spent, but didn't. Is there anything that I want to do with this money that's like more in alignment? Do I want to put it towards debt? Do I want to save it? I had a client one time that was able to take her family on a Disney trip by getting through all 100 of her urges. So things I want to buy list and starting yourself an urge jar. Don't spend any money on this. Just find stuff that you have around your house. Those are two really, really good tools that pretty much anyone can start right away. That will help.
I would also say, and this is something that is helpful for me, both in terms of consumerism and also in terms of eating and food which is, another form of consumption, is reminding yourself as often as possible that we live in a very, very sick society, like that our impulses are not normal, that our triggers and our desires and even like we can't trust our own brains because our brains have been so thoroughly poisoned. Like I've talked about it before on this channel, but like I've always very much struggled with intuitive eating as a concept because I like the things that are exposed to us, the messages, the packaging, the lighting, the processes that our food goes through, like every single aspect of the food culture that we live in, what's subsidized, what's put in front of us, what is, available in the grocery store, how the grocery store is arranged, like all of that is very, very specifically targeted to trick us, to override our own bodies and to get us addicted to things. And, that can hopefully, and for some people, listening to their intuition and just following their own impulses can be really healthy and can help them break, really unhealthy patterns. But I think it's okay if you are someone who has been very susceptible to these things